All right, so hello everyone, good day. We're continuing on with our study of the life of Saul and David and how they kind of interacted with each other, um, the way they kind of worked through challenging situations, and the way that there was a lot of conflict between the two of them. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, so hopefully you can see this. So this is number 5 of our, I guess you say session 5 of our study going through just Saul and David, the first 2 kings of Israel. And last session, just kind of a recap, we kind of looked at David as he hid in the land of the Philistines to evade Saul. We saw that Saul was no longer getting guidance from God in the way that he was hoping to. So he sought a medium to bring up Samuel for him. And through the medium, he received a message that he would soon die. And we're going to now pick up the story in 1 Samuel chapter 31. And then we're going to kind of close out 1 Samuel and get into 2 Samuel. All right. So 1 Samuel 31, starting at verse 1. And I'm got this from the New American Standard up on the screen for you today, but please follow along in your own Bibles. So starting at verse 1, it says, "Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, 'Draw your sword and pierce me through with it. Otherwise, these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make a sport of me.' But his armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men on that day together. When the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley with those who were beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and lived in them." So this was a sad day for Israel. They suffered a great defeat from the Philistines, and their king Saul fell to them as well as his sons, including Jonathan. And as we know, Jonathan was the good friend to David. Saul, we also saw it in order to prevent himself from being captured and being made a spectacle. You can kind of think back to Samson and how he was treated. So Saul thought it'd be better for him to fall on his own sword, since he was badly injured and presumably had no hope for escape or surviving. So he thought it'd be better just to die with a little bit of more on his terms, I guess is the way to say that. So sad day here, and we see that despite all his flaws, Saul was still the king of Israel, and he did represent the nation and was their leader. And even though throughout the book we've seen that Saul was kind of portrayed as the primary, the antagonist against David, he also did do some good things for the nation. He had previously, led the nation to a lot of victories and pushed back the Philistines and helped to liberate the Israelites from the trouble that the Philistines had caused. However, though, the book of Samuel, of 1 Samuel, does kind of portray him with a scarred legacy by his disobedience to God, and how he repeatedly let fear influence him more than it should have. So it kind of seems like the moral that's put out from the story is that Saul should have trusted in God and continued to seek him, where he instead, became fearful and started trying to do things on his own terms. All right, so continuing on, verse 8. "It came about on the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head, they stripped off his weapons, and they sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. They put his weapons in the temple of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. Now, when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men rose and walked all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. And they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Okay, so this is interesting, but the Philistines, they find that they've killed the Israelite king and his sons, so they're celebrating. They're going to basically send his body or his weapons around and kind of put them up as display to show that they're great victory, because previously Saul had really given trouble to the Philistines and won a lot of battles against them. So they're all excited. They're happy to do this, and they take his body. So I've got kind of a map here just to kind of put this into perspective. I'm not sure 100% how accurate this map is, but I think it gives a pretty good perspective here of a general idea anyway. So kind of down towards the south side, we've got Ziklag, which is the city that we know David went into the Philistines' land, and they gave him a spot to live in Ziklag. So it's just over the border, and that's kind of where David's been hanging out, just to stay away from Saul. And then way up towards the north side of Israel here, you see there's Endor, and I've kind of got it circled here. Endor is where Saul went to the medium to try to hear a message from God. Mount Gilboa, just south, is where he, died with his sons. And then right in the middle, you kind of see Jordan River. And then you've got Jabesh Gilead on the east side of that. And that's kind of a separation of the Jordan River. So that's where these men came, and they took Saul's body. It was men from that. So it's kind of the northern region. So just to kind of make a little more sense of what's going on here, I think it's good to have a map. So we're going to continue on. So now we're going to jump into 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. Now it came about after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, that David remained 2 days in Ziklag. On the third day, behold, a man came out of the camp of Saul with his clothes torn and dust on his head. And it came about when he came to David that he fell on the ground and prostrated himself. Then David said to him, "From where do you come?" And he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." David said to him, "How did things go? Please tell me." And he said, "The people have fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead also." So David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" The young man who told him said, "By chance, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen pursued him closely. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I said, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' And he said to me, 'Please stand beside me and kill me, for agony has seized me, because my life still lingers in me.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown which was on his head and the bracelet which was on his arm, and I brought them here to you. I brought them here to my Lord." Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and also did all the men who were with him. They mourned and they wept and they fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan and the people of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. Okay, so this is interesting. It gives us a little more info and insight into the situation. So first off, notice that David, he returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites. So the Amalekites were further south out of the land of Judah. So kind of David's living on the border of the Philistines' land and the Israelites' land, kind of in the city of Ziklag, and then further south is the land of the Amalekites. So he's going down there and slaughtering the Amalekites and then going back and hiding out in the land of the Philistines, because Saul was out to get him if he went into of Israel. So Amalekites are not great people. They were another enemy of Israel and someone that, David perpetually was, trying to help eliminate. This man who's claiming to be an Amalekite. So we just read Saul or David comes back from slaughtering some Amalekites, and then this guy comes running up that claims to be an Amalekite, and that he just happened to be on Mount Gilboa at this time when Saul was there and dying from his battle wounds. And he came to inform David of what had happened. And so this Amalekite, what he claimed to have done was he said he mercifully killed Saul, kind of helped put him out of his misery, and then he took his crown and brought it to David, his Lord, and was, doing this for David, apparently. But David and his men, they tore their clothes and they mourned, they wept and they fasted until evening because of the deaths of Saul and then Jonathan and then all the people that had been killed. So David is not excited to hear this news. He's upset and mourning, which is a little bit interesting because one would think with Saul continuing to pursue David in his life and him having to live in basically enemy territory, in a way, this is kind of like letting David have a lot more freedom now that doesn't have this antagonist that's pursuing his life constantly. But he doesn't see it that way. He doesn't see it as good news or that he can now go back and live in Israel or Judah. He sees it as this great loss for Israel. So that does show a little bit of the way that David continued to view Saul in a respectful manner, even in spite of everything that he went through. So continuing on, chapter 1, verse 13. So David's going to dig into this a little bit more. So now that he says he wept and all, but he's going to ask a little bit more detail here. And he says, so David said to the young man who told him, where are you from? And he answered, he says, I'm the son of an alien, an Amalekite. Then David said to him, how is it you were not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And David called one of the young men and said to him, go cut him down. So he struck him and he died. David said to him, your blood is on your head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. All right, so this is another seemingly strange narrative that's unfolding here. So David asked this young man where he was from. He claimed to be an Amalekite. Remember, David just came back from slaughtering the Amalekites. David confronted him for killing the Lord's anointed and ordered him to be killed. And this may seem harsh since this was seemingly a merciful killing to end Saul's suffering, if what this Amalekite had claimed was true. But this Amalekite story, as he presented it, it doesn't align with what was recorded in 1 Samuel, which clearly says that Saul fell on his own sword and so died. So there's what seems to be a contradiction between how 1 Samuel states that Saul died and how this Amalekite states that he dies. There's a couple different options here, and we aren't told from the text exactly what's happening, but it seems most likely to me reading this that this Amalekite is not being truthful. If we're going to say what's clearly written in 1 Samuel, and that Saul fell on his sword, then it would seem to follow that this Amalekite has maybe just happened to come by Saul's body after he'd already fell on his sword, and then he just took his crown and went to David with a false story, thinking this was somehow going to earn him some sort of reward. That's what seems to make sense to me the most. There's maybe something else going on here as well, but this Amalekite isn't really spoken of as being a trustworthy person or anything like that anywhere in the text. So I don't really have any reason to think that he was being more honest than what was clearly written by the narrator of 1 Samuel that did happen. Also, 1 Chronicles 16:22 and Psalms 105:15 say, do not touch my anointed ones and do my prophets no harm. And so, at least in the New American Standard, those verses are identical. But it's pretty clear. Don't touch God's anointed ones. Don't harm his prophets. And as we've seen in previous sessions, Saul was named among the prophets, and David was not willing to do any harm to Saul. Twice when it was within his power to do so, he refused to stretch out his hand or harm Saul because he was the Lord's anointed. So it appears that David realized that as God's anointed, he should not be killed by a faithful follower of God, and David took that very seriously. So considering this narrative, David either saw through the Amalekites' falsehood and acted accordingly, or he believed the Amalekite and punished him for what he claimed to have done, which was to strike down the Lord's anointed. So either way, I think it would make sense for David to act in that way, knowing kind of where he was coming from on other things. All right, verse 17. Then David chanted with his lament over Saul and Jonathan his son, and he told them to teach the sons of Judah the song of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jashar, your beauty, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How have the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will exult. O mountains of Gilboa, let not dew or rain be on you, nor fields or of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. But from the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and pleasant in their life, and in their death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How have the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? Jonathan is slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was more wonderful than the love of women. How have the mighty fallen and the weapons of war perished? So again, we see David, he did not rejoice in the death of Saul, even though he continued to try to kill him. Instead, he chanted a lament over Saul and Jonathan, and he spoke of the good things done by Saul for Israel and spoke of Saul as beloved and pleasant. Maybe not the words I would have chose, seeing what Saul had done previously. So while the narrative in 1 Samuel kind of accentuates Saul's shortcomings and not his successes, Saul did, however, do some good things for Israel. And we read about those in 1 Samuel as well. He helped lead Israel to military victories over the enemies of Israel, and as well as he worked through some difficult times being Israel's first king and making some changes there. And then also Jonathan was presented through the book as a wonderful man of character and an ally and a support to David. Although most people probably have expected him to be envious of David and would have expected Jonathan to have a desire to inherit his father's throne and tried to make sure that wouldn't happen with David. Instead, we see him very much supporting David, which is great. So while overall 1 Samuel maybe brings up a lot of character flaws of Saul, he did do some good things. And as it says here, he had, what David said, that he clothed them luxuriously in scarlet and put ornaments of gold in their apparel. Presumably this would have been through helping Israel defeat some of the enemies in military battle. So we did read earlier in 1 Samuel that Saul was a great military leader, at least early on as king. All right, moving on. So 1 Samuel chapter 2, starting at verse 1. Then it came about afterwards that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to one of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. So David said, where shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. So David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the widow of Nabal of the Carmelite. And David brought up his men who were with him, each with his household, and they lived in the cities of Hebron. Then the men of Judah came there and anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, may you be blessed of the Lord, because you have shown this kindness to Saul your Lord and have buried him. Now may the Lord show loving kindness and truth to you, and I also will show this goodness to you, because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strong and be valiant, for Saul your Lord is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim and made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, and over Benjamin, even over all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he was king for 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David. The time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Okay, so again, looking at the map, so David would have been down in this area of Ziklag towards the southern side, the bottom of the map here. And that's a city in Philistia, near the border of Judah. So after the death of Saul, he inquired of Yahweh, the Lord, on if he should go over to a city of Judah. So remember, he was hiding in Philistia because he was pursued by Saul, and realized that if he stayed in Saul's area of dominion, he was going to be killed eventually. So he's hiding out in the enemy territory. So he asked God, should I go back into Judah? And Yahweh God said, yes. So he said, where should I go? And he said, Hebron, which you see is not terribly far away, and also fairly near the border. So he goes there, and he moved from the land of the Philistines back to Judah, and they anointed him king over Judah, which is interesting because previously Israel had been one nation with one king over the tribes. Now we see Judah, they see that David has moved back, and David is a Judean, so this is his native tribe, so he's back in that land. They make him king. And then he reaches out, and he hears that Kadesh Gilead are the ones that had went and retrieved Saul's body and brought it back and buried his bones and all. So he sends them a message basically saying, blessings to you for doing this. This was a good thing, and lets them know that Judah has anointed them king. And I mean, this is basically him kind of reaching out saying, I don't want to have trouble with you. He's seeking peace between these groups. But it's interesting because where previously there was 12 tribes of Israel who were the 12 sons of Jacob that became Israel. They were one united nation. There's now this split with Judah splitting off into a different nation. And this, in this capacity, David reigned for 7.5 years, while Abner takes one of Saul's other sons that obviously didn't die with him in battle and just decides to make him king over the rest of Israel. So,
can I watch something?
One second.
Something.
Sorry, son was coming in and bothered me for a question real quick. So moving on now. So yeah, we got David basically reigning as king for 7.5 years over just Judah, though, and you've got the rest of Israel separate. So there's this division, and it's something that's going to, continue. If you know the history of Israel and Judah, there's a long history of not friendly behaviors between those two groups, if we'll just say it that way. So chapter 2, verses 12, starting at what it says, now Abner, the son of Ner, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon with the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon. And they sat down, one on the one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. Then Abner said to Joab, now let the young men arise and hold a contest before us. And Joab said, let them arise. So they arose and went over by count, 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 for the servants of David. Each one of them seized his opponent by the head, and they thrust their sword into the opponent's side, so they fell down together. Therefore, that place was called Helka Hazarim, which is in Gibeon. And that day, the battle was very severe, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. Now the 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was as swift-footed as the gazelles which is in the field. Asahel pursued Abner and did not turn to the right or to the left from following Abner. Then Abner looked behind him and said, is that you, Asahel? And he said, it is I. So Abner said to him, turn to your right or to your left and take hold of one of the young men for yourself and take for yourself his spoil. But Asahel was not willing to turn aside from following him. Abner repeated again to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab?" However, he refused to turn aside. Therefore, Abner struck him in the belly with the butt end of the spear, so that the spear came out of his back, and he fell there and died on the spot. And it came about, all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still. Okay, so this is just all around strange and bad idea. But the commander of the Israelite army, this is Abner, he went to Gibeon to meet with Joab, who's one of the leaders of David's army, and he suggested that the young men should have this little competition. So they both agree, and everyone, they get up and they just go stab each other, and it's this terrible disaster. And then it sounds like it kind of turns into a battle, and they start chasing each other around. And one of Joab's brothers, Asahel, he starts chasing Abner, and we hear that he's very fast, and they just keep chasing him around until finally Abner decided to kill him with a spear. I mean, it's just craziness going on here. All right. So then, but Joab and Abishai, so this is the brothers, they pursued Abner. And when the sun was going down, they came to the hill of Ammon, which is in front of Giah by the way of the wilderness of Gibeon. And the sons of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner and became one band. And they stood on top of a certain hill. And if you remember this, so the sons of Benjamin, that's the people of the tribe of Benjamin. Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, so his son also would be. So that kind of makes sense that you've got Judah behind David, David being of the tribe of Judah, and you've got Benjamin specifically behind Ishbosheth and Abner, as they were from Benjamin. Okay, but anyway, and then Abner, he became one band, they stood on top of a certain hill. Then Abner called to Joab and said, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the end? How long will you refrain from telling people to turn back from following their brothers?" Okay, so Abner came over to meet them, and he kind of had suggested this challenge to start with. And then, there's this big battle that breaks out, this craziness that breaks out. He ends up killing this other guy. And now when he's pursued, now he decides to call out to Joab and, "Shall the sword devour forever? This will just be bitter in the end." He's like, let's just put this behind us. Let's all stop. Because he says, "How long will you refrain from telling the people to turn back from following their brothers?" Now we're brothers, right? This was just a big challenge before. Now they're brothers. That's what he's trying to say here. So Joab said, as God lives, if you had not spoken, surely then the people would have gone away in the morning, each from following his brother." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the people halted and pursued Israel no longer, nor did they continue to fight anymore. Abner and his men went through the Arabah all that night, so that they crossed the Jordan, walking all morning, and they came to Mahanaim. Then Joab returned from following Abner, and when he had gathered all the people together, 19 of David's servants, besides Asahel, were missing. But the servants of David had struck down many of Benjamin and Abner's men, so that 360 men died. And they took Asahel and they buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. Then Joab and his men went all night until day dawned at Hebron. All right, so after the death of their brother Asahel, who had been killed by Abner, they continued to pursue him. And then they gathered the people of Benjamin, and then Joab and Abner, they decided to cease fighting. They parted ways. But I mean, right here, what we're getting at is that there's this early conflict between the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. This isn't like, hey, we're friendly neighbors. It's okay. You guys can have David as your king. We'll have Ishbosheth, and we'll just, agree to be still, kind of like allies and kingdoms that are, right next to each other. We're all sons of Abraham. It's right off. There's this challenge. There's, this kind of disagreement. There's battle with them killing each other. I mean, this should not have been happening between Israelites. They should not have been out killing each other and challenging each other. They were supposed to be on the same team. So right off, early on, so basically as soon as David's anointed king, we start seeing this conflict take place. So it's kind of a story of David's life, right? I mean, he just conflict after conflict. We read about it early on with him defeating Goliath, and then, all the chaos with Saul's household. Saul's, now dead, and now there's this conflict with Saul's son and his armies. David went through a lot of things. He had a tough life in a lot of ways. Okay, so just kind of a quick summary here of what we covered. Basically, we saw that Saul went up to a battle with the Philistines and died in a battle at Mount Gilboa, as was predicted when he visited the medium at Endor. David was very saddened by that, and he mourned instead of rejoicing at the death of his antagonist. David asked the Lord, Yahweh, if he should return to Judah, which was his homeland, and he was told by God to go to Hebron, which was a city in Judah. And after moving there, the people anointed him king over Judah. After Saul's death, Abner, the commander of his army, made Ishbosheth, one of Saul's sons, to be king over Israel, with Judah excluded. Ishbosheth was 40 years old, and from the research I saw, kind of backtracking the dates, David would have been about 30 years old when he became the king of Judah. And Abner, who is the commander of the Israeli army, basically commander under Saul's son, he came to Gibeon, which was a city near Jerusalem, and he proposed to Joab, the leader of the Judean army, that a game of challenge between Judah and Israel should take place. And then we kind of just read about all the disaster that worked out to be. But basically, that's the start of this division between Judah and the rest of Israel that continues on for quite some time. So trying to pull out some application points, as this is kind of more of a history of what happened, and kind of letting us know the backstory of how Israel became this nation and how the kings were first there. But I think there's still some points that we can see here and that we can apply to our own lives and make sure we don't make some of the same mistakes and that were made back then, and that we can follow some of the good things that were done back then and use those historical figures as examples for us. So I think some of the application points that were clear here is that Saul kind of continued in his stubborn ways, even when God ceased to guide him, and he ended up straying from God's ways, guidance, and his commands. And he ended up dying in battle along with his son, Jonathan. And I think we can take that as a warning that we should be seeking God's ways and always follow him instead of our own desires. David is portrayed in the narrative as genuinely saddened by Saul's death, even though he was the primary antagonist towards David. So I think this can show us that David had a strong character and a commitment to follow and honor God's instructions as his appointed ruler. At least that's kind of what's portrayed here in this sense. And this positive character example should encourage us, I think, to likewise seek to first and foremost seek God's plans rather than our own. And I think that's a thing that you see over and over through the Bible, is you see the characters that are portrayed throughout the Old Testament, especially. So shortly after Saul's death, we saw one of his sons, Ishbosheth, was set up as king of Israel, and David was once again not put in the proper place that he should have been. And again, he was in this difficult and troubling situation. And I think this continued pattern of rejection and dismissal of David, you see, it didn't dishearten him or change him to turn away from God, but he continued to seek God's guidance. And, we saw that he received some clear instructions. He asked God if he should return to Judah, and he was told so, and he was even told what city to go to. So we see that God is still working actively through David and guiding him. But I think it's, again, an example for us to continue to seek God and his guidance in spite of whatever challenges we face. So whenever things get real tough for us, rather than us just throwing our hands up and being frustrated, still turn to God, still seek and follow him. All right, and then finally, so Israel, with what I would say is a worldly appointed leader, we had the commander of an army appoint who the king was going to be, rather than them seeking God or guidance in any way like that. And then we've got Judah with a God-appointed ruler, as we remember Samuel had anointed David previously. So we've got these worldly leader and a godly appointed ruler, and they're at odds with each other and in competition with each other. So I think this highlights the inherent conflict and drama that naturally arises between a worldly way of things and a godly way of things. But I think we can still draw some encouragement and strength from the struggle that David fought through and overcame. And so likewise, I think we can draw strength and encouragement of seeking God and his kingdom goals first and foremost, rather than letting the worldly ways dismay us and discourage us. So that's what I had to share today. We'll open it up for some discussion. I'm not sure how much there'll be, but we'll do some discussion, and then we'll maybe do like 20 minutes of discussion, then we'll go into a time of prayer. So if you want to make a comment, raise your hand or get my attention some other way, and we'll just kind of go through in an orderly fashion. All right. Looks like Dean is up first. Go ahead, Dean.
Well, what I see from this is at this point in time in David's life, he had just great integrity. He honored the things of God and the way things went. And so this is highly commendable for David at this point in his life. Good teaching.
Thanks, Dean. Yeah, I mean, when we read through the whole story of David, there's obviously some really good things he did and some really bad things he did. But at this point, there's kind of highlighting, at least the narration is kind of highlighting the good things about David. Later on, we'll see some less pleasant things. Donna, go ahead. You're muted, Donna.
All right. It never ceases to amaze me. As I look in the Old Testament and the New, God is God, Jesus, Jesus. One of the things that comes to my mind is, personality is personality. God will work with you. I don't think that it was the Lord's original plan, God's original plan that, he has to play with the hand that he has been dealt. God has to work with men, in the season of their life. And I think that, Saul, even though he didn't have great characteristics, he was I think he was a very insecure individual for whatever reason. I don't know, maybe it was his raising or his mom spanked him. I don't really know. But I think that his insecurity as a leader, as a man, caused him to be very fearful. So to be fair, just to be fair in the analysis of Saul, he had some undesired characteristics, as we see in many of the kings that were chosen. Nebuchadnezzar was an idiot. And then when he was on, practicing the principles and loving God and being fair to the people. And even David, was a jerk sometimes and massacred some people because he was into himself, so you can see this, just parsing out characteristics and characters throughout the whole Bible. There are people just like you and I in their season of life and, what they did and what they didn't do. But another thing that came to my mind, Kenny, when you were teaching, with Jesus, he kind of unveiled the spiritual battle of the enemy, the satanic forces. They were around way back then too, and how people can open up their heart and their minds, to Satan, like the witch of Endor. You think there might have been some witchcraft going on. Yeah, I'm laughing because I have heard through the grapevine that even our government, goes to mediums and stuff. And I know that that's not a conspiracy theory. It's well known that the Clintons did, for real. And so, people do different things for guidance, and they don't really have this awesome relationship with God. And even then, there's, no guarantee that everything's going to go your way because of the millennial kingdom. Everything will be recognized. But I think the world is very fallen back then, even now. And one of the things that I tend to do too is time has not changed character. And if God can get a good leader, man, I'll tell you what, it's like the ace of spades when God gets a good leader that has a heart for the people and for the things of God. But, considering the story and where God comes in, in all fairness, I think that Saul had a lot of things against him because of his fear and his insecurity as, a man. He just didn't have the emotional sobriety or stability to stay even keel. And, was he an evil man? I think he did some things just like our government does today. Joe Biden, they make lawless rules. And I'm just sparsing this out, so it's just not all about, Saul and David, and to have some perspective about character, our character, if we want to play off of this, being very sincere with the Lord, and trying hard not to botch things up by knowing the things that Jesus spoke. How do I translate this into my society today? How can I learn from this story? And I think about knowing the things that Jesus preached, having that heart, and not getting caught up in my insecurities, in my wanting praise, wanting accolades, from everyone around me, and staying very genuine. And I think David had that kind of concept. He had more of that than the other thing. And that's, I think, why he appears to be more of a desired leader in a position. And I think about a verse where it says, when the righteous rule, the city rejoices. And when the wicked rule, misery lands on a nation. I think that's true, about leadership in any in any phase of life, even way back then, when Constantine was a leader and changed all the rules of religion, to suit his fancy or whatever they were doing over there, making laws. And, lawlessness is about making laws that are not fitting according to God's rule, because it's going to punish people. It's going to make people believe and do things that they shouldn't believe and do. And you got to make up your mind, who you're going to follow and who you're going to please. And so, I don't know, I got all this out of the story of David and Saul. This is what I espoused out for me, the takeaway for me, and also the spiritual battle that, Satan was roaring back then, just like he is now, and being aware of all that in your own tendencies. And, if you raise your hand to be a leader, you better be very faithful, because, there's a judgment day all coming for us all, not just for Saul and David. And I don't want to be in the line that says you have totally blown it, girl, because of your ego and because of doing things that you wanted to do and not listening to me, because it's got to be about, the people and ruling righteously. And I mean, I wouldn't be a good leader. Don't put me in the government. God, I'll blow it. I'm too crazy. I'm not stable enough, and I think when picking leaders out for anything, whether it's a king, I do think that God has a preference, but he's got to work with the hand that he's dealt with. He's got to work with people. It's kind of like God's hands are kind of tied too. He can't pop up a person out of nowhere, and make them a leader. And hence, I can't compare them at all with Jesus, who was a righteous man and chose to be a blessing. He chose out of the goodness of his heart. He chose, he had to work it, and he was the perfecter, as far as a leader, and somebody that you could follow, and his, ideas and his, the things that he weighed and thought was important, to people. And, he became famous for the short time that he was alive, but nobody really likes Saul anymore. When you're like, Saul, yay, David. It's just the way our mind goes. But I think that Saul had some characteristics that were good about him, and David had, lust, and, he was a womanizer and stuff like that. So he had some real iffy things, but he pulled it off when God gave him an opportunity to walk, kind of spanked him and said, shook him up and said, look, you can't be doing this. You better get it together or you're out. And, I feel bad for Saul that he lost because of his fear and his ego and being a people pleaser and be more about that. So anyways, that's my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, that's good, Donna. I think the kind of the warning there for us is, obviously Saul was kind of set up in a rough spot because he's made to be king over Israel. And at that point, God's basically said that Israel had rejected God by even asking for a king. So he's getting set up over a group of people that are not being ideally, godly people at that point. And then we did see that Saul did a lot of great things to start with, but it does seem like at some point either pride or fear or a combination of the two caused him to get off track. And I think that's basically what all of us are tempted with in life, right? Like things start going well for us and we can get prideful and say, look what I've done for myself. And we get fearful of well, I've got all this, it's going right for me. What if I lose it all? And you start making compromising mistakes, and it's a real slippery slope real quickly. And and I think you kind of can see that same type of thing with David, even in the sense that he makes similar type of mistakes where he starts to get this like a little bit prideful where he can just do whatever he wants, and starts just later on in his life, we haven't got to that part yet, but he kind of disregards God's instructions. And and we see that with so many characters throughout the Bible. If they're faithful and they're following God right, God's pleased with them. And if they get caught up in their own selfishness and put themselves first, whether that be fearful or pride, things start to go poorly for them. But I imagine Jesus was very familiar with these records of David and Saul, and he could have kind of drawn it, like, what's a good leader look like? What are the good characteristics, and what are the things that we need to avoid? So Jesus would have known, don't make these same mistakes that Saul and David made. And Jesus obviously perfectly did what he was supposed to. He's the true example of what a godly king should be. So it's really cool when you start studying into it. There's just so much depth to this stuff. Let's see, we've got a bunch of other hands up. I think the order was Phyllis and Steve next, and then Edgardo.
Based on everything that we've been saying, even though the people wanted a king, and that's how they ended up getting Saul, but I can't forget that Saul was still anointed by God. Even though he had his weaknesses and everything, but God anointed him. That was not just saying, okay, you go be king, let's go. He gave him, made available to him through this anointing, everything he would need to be a good king. It was how Saul, he feared man more than God. He used his free will in a way that was not in accordance to what God said. He could get stubborn. David had his faults too. He made some terrible mistakes. They were both kings. They were both anointed. The difference was David would repent. He would throw himself down before the Lord and he would repent. And so, yes, I know that we look at these things and we learn from these things. And hopefully we see we're not to repeat those mistakes. But if we do, because we're all going to make our own share of mistakes, the key is a heart of repentance in the event this happens. Be like David. God loved the heart of David. He didn't like the mistakes David made, but he loved his heart.
Thanks, Phyllis. Good point there. Let's see. Paul asked a question in the chat. I'll get to real quick, then we'll go to you, Edgardo. But Paul said, does anyone know why David was anointed by the people of Judah in Hebron when he had already been anointed by Samuel? So when he was anointed by Samuel, that would have been, I think, in a fairly private place. I don't think it was in front of all of Israel or all of Judah, even, where they all knew this was like a thing and he was now supposed to be the king. I think that was a fairly private thing with his family involved. So I think this was more of like the official, Judah saying, Saul, our king's gone, so now we need to have a new king, and they go ahead and they accept David at that point into that official capacity. At least that's my understanding of that.
Yeah,
Right, so more an officiation sort of thing.
yeah, people in that region during the that period, what scholars call the ancient Near East, typically when a king was going to become king, there would be a ceremony where essentially the king and the people would make a covenant together, and the king would have certain benefits and obligations, the people would have certain benefits and obligations, and it would be a sort of a if you think about a marriage, for instance, coming together in a marriage, you had that when a king would become king. And so it just says that they anointed him but there would have been something along those lines where it was making that an official thing between himself and those people.
Okay. Thanks.
Go ahead, Edgardo.
Yeah, I was going over the applications that you have made. It was really very scary, uh, seeing the example of Saul's disobedience, and a lot of things uh, have gone from him, like the throne, and also his sons will no longer enjoy being in the position of a king. The first thing really that touched me a lot is when the first application that you mentioned here. I want to read it. Uh, you you stated that Saul continued in his stubborn ways even when God ceased to guide him and ended up straying from God, straying from God's ways, guidance, and commands. He ended up dying in battle along with his son Jonathan. We should take this as a warning to seek God's ways and always follow Him instead of our own desires. I love this part, because indeed, if you will not follow God, there's always a consequence to it. And I'd admire David because when he committed sins against God, he repented really. We can read Psalms 51, a record of his being repentant in that particular passage of the scripture. And also, I'd like to share one verse here. Proverbs 11, verse 8. It says, "The righteous man is rescued from trouble, and it comes on the wicked instead." Uh, we can see that in the life of Saul and David in that particular story that we are studying right now. So the warning is so clear, the challenge is so clear, and if we want to maintain our good standing before God, we have to continue on being obedient to His lead, to His leading, to His will, to His word. Whatever it is that God wants us to do, let us uh, try our best to follow it so that we will be in the right direction and no harm will befall us. Just like what this verse is saying in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 21. It says here, "No harm befalls the righteous, but the wicked have their fill of trouble." That's all, Kenny. Thank you for the teaching.
Thank you, Edgardo. Good stuff there. So yeah, I think the stubbornness that we see of Saul is kind of the big warning, and at least to me, it's kind of the thing that's like warns me like, don't get too arrogant and stubborn because you can get yourself into some bad trouble. He would, to me, just reading this, it's like I don't understand why Saul didn't, when he's told, hey, you're going to go die tomorrow, whether that message came from God or man or evil beings or whatever. He had this message that he's going to be dying very soon. At that point, you would think he would just absolutely repent and just say, I'm done. I'm quitting. God's not speaking to me anymore. You would think he would say, I know God is working through David. Maybe I need to step down and let David be the king. But he doesn't do it. He just goes out and continues to battle. And because of that, not only does Saul die, but his sons die. And I mean, there's some serious consequences there. And it's quite sad. So yeah, I think there's a lot that we can learn, and there's a lot of things for God to work through us, and we just need to be receptive of that. Let's see, I don't know the order next. I think let's go to Dustin, and then we'll go to John and Josiah.
Are you able to hear me? Yes, okay. So I guess I'm thinking two things, and one is I think a little bit more valuable, and the second one is a little bit more of speculation. But I'm thinking kind of in the if we're thinking of looking at this in the perspective of like leadership and God selecting leaders and behavior of leaders and accountability of leaders and that sort of thing, it's very interesting that and Phyllis pointed this out, that that Saul was a leader chosen by God. Saul didn't like try to take this upon himself. In fact, he was reluctant at the beginning. You remember that. But he was chosen by God. God anointed him. He was, practically speaking, the anointed king. He was the Mashiach at that point. In fact, the first one. So that's interesting. And you could point out, we could look at some good things that he did. There were some positives to his life, obviously. There was definitely some bad things. And it's very interesting that it's in the turning point of the story to where God goes and starts to select a new king and starts to groom a new king and actually has Samuel anoint David, was after some serious points of Saul's disobedience. And there's an interesting point here, is that it is possible for God to choose a leader, and then that leader, instead of responding with faithfulness, humility, obedience, if that leader chooses to be disobedient, then God can immediately reject that leader that was chosen by God and go and pick another one. And there's this kind of mentality that I've noticed that we will look at a particular leader who definitely has some serious flaws. I'm not saying that they're just, they're sinners like everyone else. They're imperfect. They've got some serious flaws, but there's some people that they want to ignore all of that, and they only want to look at the good things about this particular person. And imagine someone is reading, 1 Samuel, and they want to ignore all the bad things about Saul, and they only want to focus on the good things. You would say, okay, you're not taking all the evidence seriously. You're being misguided. You have to look at the big picture here. And it's not about weighing one over the other. It's the fact that, there's a line that's been crossed multiple times. And, we can't have this sort of like idealistic picture of leaders, whether that's leaders in a community or teachers or pastors or world leaders or governor, whatever that may be. They might have started off well, but through disobedience, it's very possible that the initial, if they do even have a sense of actually being chosen by God, which is kind of hard to demonstrate these days, I will say that. I would be very, very cautious to say God chose this person for this role. I don't know that insight, but God can reject someone that God has already chosen. I think that's the point. And I think that's important when we start thinking about, I think probably in our more local context would be leaders or pastors or leaders of ministry. Unrepentant sin means this person is probably going to be disqualified, and we should start looking to another leader. That's kind of like my first thing. The other one is more of a speculation thing. I do wonder, the Apostle Paul, whose given name was Saul, it's obviously you're to be named Saul is to be named after King Saul of 1 Samuel's fame. And of course, Saul, the apostle, also was from the line of Benjamin. That particular part he has some pride in, because when King Solomon died and the kingdom divided, there were 10 tribes that left and no longer wanted to support David, who was the rightful king. They should have supported David, and Benjamin was the only faithful tribe that followed Judah. So he has a little bit of pride in that, but I can't help but think, and this is just more speculation, I don't know if I have any evidence for it, that you might have a chip on your shoulder being named after a king that's known for disobedience. I don't know. That's just more of a speculation thing, but that's all that I was thinking about.
Yeah, great points, Dustin. And yeah, it is interesting. I thought about that before too. Saul being a Benjamite and being named after Saul, King Saul's like obviously either his parents didn't have high hopes for him, or Saul was at least somewhat regarded as still a good character, being the first king, and people still had respect for him even in spite of his faults, which I would think may be the case that I've kind of leaned towards, is like even though he had some faults, people still did respect him as the first king, and obviously David respected him as the first king still. So it is some interesting stuff. John and Josiah, go ahead.
So I just one little quick thing in response to Dustin's first point. I think the other thing that what he talked about makes me think about is it's just one more evidence amongst tons all throughout the scriptures of the idea that God is not controlling everything, right? In the sense of actually making the things happen that are happening, but rather the way God is in charge is making decisions and doing things, interacting and intervening. So you have, God chooses Saul, and that doesn't work out, so he's going to choose somebody else, right? So that's God's means of control, is interaction, as opposed to the typical Reformed Calvinist idea that God is just controlling those things. So God wanted Saul to be king, and it was his plan for Saul to be disobedient and to remove him and put David in place and so on and so forth, which just seems like utter nonsense in light of what you're just reading in the story. I agree. I think there's a lot in that, this idea that, our obedience is really important to God's interaction with us. I think about the thing with in Jeremiah, where God takes Jeremiah to the potter's house, and the potter is working with this clay, and the clay won't cooperate, so he's going to do something else with it, right? And so there's some lessons there. But the main thing that I wanted to just comment about is that so many of the things that you read in these stories about Saul and David, and we saw again today, all of these little things that occur, they remind me of the verse at the end of Judges. This is the very, very last verse of Judges. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And you learn that really it says that there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what it was right in their own eyes, but that it wasn't that there wasn't a king. There was a king. His name was Yahweh, and that's the king that they were supposed to be following, but they kept rejecting him. And eventually God finally says, Samuel, give him a king, and it ends up being Saul, right? And in that record, God says that they haven't rejected you, Samuel, they've rejected me as their king. And the flip side of that rejection of God's king, it says everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And you can see in all of these records that that's the dynamic that's going on. Rather than making God king and being under his reign and rule and following his plan and his direction, people keep just doing the thing that they want to do. We saw it in the record with the difference between the Amalekites' response and David's response. So the Amalekite at Saul's death is thinking, hey, here's an opportunity for me, right? I'm going to take this crown. I'm going to go to David and bring him this crown, tell him this news. I'm going to lie about it, and it's going to get me something. It doesn't exactly say that, but it's just oozing out of the pages that this is what's going on with this guy, and that, you know, he thinks he's going to get, you know, somehow in good with David for doing this, and David kills him instead. But you know, the David's response to Saul's death is to mourn and to be heartbroken over this. And you know, why does he do that? Because this was God's anointed, right? This was God's chosen, God's plan, and David's just trying to be under God's plan. And you know, even in David's own life, when you see him go astray, it's because in this same dynamic, he's not following God. He's deciding his own way, right? He's doing what is right in his own eyes. And so all throughout here, Saul, you see it between the Israelites and Judah. The Israelites want to go their own way, and between Abner and Joab. And every single time, if you ask the question, when you see this, if you ask the question, is the person following God or doing what is right in their own eyes, that question and that dynamic comes out in all of these different records. And you see over and over again, all throughout the entire Bible, this is the question. Are you going to follow your own way and your own heart, as people like to say today? Are you going to do what's right in your own eyes, or are you going to do what's right in the eyes of God? Are you going to follow God? Are you going to be under the reign and rulership of God? Are you going to follow his anointed, Jesus? You know, are you, you know, choose which you're going to do, right? So anyway, that's just, it makes me think about that stuff.
Yeah. Good thoughts. Thanks, John. Good stuff. Okay, well, let's go ahead and kind of close out the discussion here, and we'll move into a time of prayer. So I'm going to end the recording. So thanks everyone for adding to the discussion, for hanging in here as we go through this. If you're watching this and haven't joined us in person before, we invite you to come and join us for fellowship and discussion and prayer and all that good stuff. So look in the description for info on how to do that.